Welcome to the IVM Podcast Network.
Will India's space program remain relevant and competitive in the coming decades?
Will Britain give up its last colony in the Indian Ocean?
Do Indians conduct enough research on how to engage China?
We'll be discussing all of this and more on this week's episode of the Pragati Podcast.
We are your hosts Pavan Srinath
and Hamsini Hariharan,
and we get together every 2 weeks to discuss economics, politics and policy. In the first half of today's episode, Hamsini and I will be discussing events in June that you might have missed.
In the second half, I sit down with my fellow colleague Pranay Kotastane and Dr. Alka Acharya, one of India's foremost experts on China, to understand what's lacking in our analysis of China and what we further need to do to meet challenges from our neighbor.
So, Hamsini, June has been an eventful month, right?
It
so,
has.
what all are the things that we won't be discussing in this podcast?
Well, today's podcast is not covering a number of things. For example, our presidential elections are going on. Our Prime Minister visited US this week, actually. There are riots in Gorkhaland about wanting a new state.
And farm loan waivers are like this infectious virus, like the throat infection bug that's running around in Bangalore, right? So state after state is getting into the idea that they should waive off farm loans. And now the government of India is also thinking about whether it should intervene.
True. And then there was that cricket match where people got slapped with sedition charges if they celebrated Pakistan's victory. So it's been an eventful month, but let's not discuss that. I'm thinking of news that people might have not caught up on amongst all this hullabaloo of what's been running in the newspapers. For example, do you know what is Britain's last colony in the Indian Ocean?
No.
It's this idyllic little island. It's now where everyone goes for destination weddings from India, apparently. But it's part of Mauritius. So Mauritius got independence from Britain in 1968. But Britain retained a part of the colony, a part of the island called Chagos. And why Chagos is also important is, even though Mauritius got independence in 68, 2 years before it was granted independence, Britain leased a part of it out to the US, this place called Diego Garcia, which most people don't talk about anymore.
Right.
Because it's sort of the world's biggest known secret in a lot of ways. Diego Garcia is important because it is the United States outpost in the Indian Ocean. It's where it launched attacks during the Persian War in the 90s, the War on Terror in 2001, and even the Iraq War. That was the base for the US Air Force during all of this.
Along with the US fleet in the Persian Gulf,
yes,
Diego Garcia becomes a major base for operations, right?
Yeah, and this is important because when UK leased out Diego Garcia to the US, the inhabitants over there were simply evicted. And it is a very small island. It's very thin. It was thinly populated. And around the 1990s, islanders started challenging this, both in UK courts and in international courts. And why all of this is even relevant now is because last week, the UNGA called for a resolution on whether the UNGA is the United Nations General Assembly. So they asked countries whether we should defer to the International Court of Justice on whether it's even valid for the US to retain Chagos under international law, which is interesting. Of course, the resolution was passed to ask the ICJ for an advisory opinion. I think a number of countries, I think it was 95 countries or so that voted in favor of going for the resolution.
Including India?
Including India, which is great, because India said that it has a long-standing policy on what it stands on Chagos, which is Chagos should go back to Mauritius.
I mean, that's coming from a more traditional anti-colonial stance, right?
Yes.
India has always supported the liberation of imperial colonies, and this is perhaps the last vestige left in the Indian Ocean. If I'm not mistaken, there's even an episode in Yes Minister where they vaguely refer to some British Indian Ocean territory of some sort, which must be this, I'm guessing.
Yes, it is this.
Right. So, okay. So you have the UK, which has not surrendered these islands to Mauritius. And you have the United States as someone who has taken a lease on one of the islands for Diego Garcia. So what's going to happen with Diego Garcia once Mauritius, say, takes it over?
Nothing, actually.
Okay.
So what happened is that the UK leased it to the US in, I think, 1966 for a period of 50 years. The lease was up last year and they extended the lease, which is why this issue is even coming up now. But Mauritius has told the US that nothing is going to really change with Diego Garcia. It's just that the leaser will change in a
Right.
sense.
And probably it's a nice source of revenue for
Exactly.
Mauritius.
But what's interesting is that the UK said to Mauritius that it would give Chagos back to the country when it was done using it for defense purposes, which is slightly laughable because it sets no timeline whatsoever. And it's one of those, yeah, we'll give it to you whenever we're done with it. But, when is that going to be?
So Britain seems to be quite possessive of island colonies that it has. I think, there was a reaction in the Falklands in the 80s. I'm not saying anything that nasty will happen over here, but it just feels interesting.
Yeah, in that sense, it's a repeat of history because if you think of the Falklands War, that was a lot of diversionary war theorists, the theorists who believed that when a country is going through a lot of turmoil internally, redirects it for a show of nationalism, which would be interesting considering what Britain is
Surgical
going through.
strikes.
But another angle to think about is also what is the ICJ doing? The ICJ has lost a lot of credibility. Even if the
ICJ being the International Criminal Court of Justice.
Yes. So the International Court of Justice has only an advisory opinion. Its rule is not binding, right? So even if it says, Britain has to give Chagos back to Mauritius and Britain chooses not to, nothing's going to happen for it except for the ICJ losing credibility. Because if you think about it, a year ago, the ICJ passed a verdict saying that about the South China Sea, where they said that parts of the South China Sea belong to the Philippines and China just chose to ignore it. So it's also about the credibility of international law.
Fair enough. So even though the US is not necessarily going to lose out its base in the current scenario, even if Mauritius is able to take over Chagos, it's still very reluctant, right? It wants to maintain the status quo. It supported UK in the resolution.
Yeah, so the way the US looks at it, the US voted against the resolution to even take it to the ICJ because if there's going to be resettlement around Diego Garcia, right, if you're going to have islanders moving, it's going to make security even harder for the US, particularly in an area that's so far away from its own.
Security, informational security,
more than anything else,
espionage.
intelligence.
Right. And for what it's worth, Mauritius does have very close strategic relations and financial relations with India.
Yes, it does.
So India voting in favor of Mauritius seems to be small but significant.
It is significant. So I was reading this article by Devarupa Mitra and
in The Wire?
In The Wire. And it was talking about how earlier in the year, the US National Security Advisor and even the US Secretary of State were pushing higher ups in the Indian bureaucracy to vote against the resolution and even use India's own clout with Mauritius to take the petition away from the UNGA, which is interesting if you think about it, because there's also the larger US-India relationship in the Indo-Pacific, right? So US is saying, as one of our important friends, maybe you should back us up on this because we share strategic interests in this area. So India backing Mauritius might seem small, might seem predictable to many, but it's very important.
And of course, the context of all of this is that the United States, especially under Trump, is sort of no longer the global policeman with a big stick,
yes.
Right? Which it has been for a long time. And especially in a maritime situation, somebody needs to provide the public good, which is shipping lane security.
Yes.
And for better or worse, the United States was providing that for the Indian Ocean and many other parts of the world for the last several decades. So now, Diego Garcia is, of course, one thing, but the question is who will be the, security provider in the Indian Ocean and whether, India can sort of manage its own domain without too much need for American intervention.
That's true. So while I was nursing a hangover, colonial or otherwise, what have I missed out on reading, Pawan?
So some events would have definitely fallen on your radar. Just about a week ago, we had ISRO sending its latest PSLV off with another number of satellites, 38, some number that pops up every time. frankly, I'm not too interested in news of the PSLV. So that's like, it's like a train reaching on time, right? I'm not trivializing the achievements of ISRO, but ISRO is doing its job when a regular space vehicle reaches its destination and releases satellites. The bigger deal was on June 5th, India launched its heaviest payload ever using a different launch vehicle called the GSLV Mark III.
Wait, this was called Fat Boy.
People in Indian media called it Fat Boy. I mean, some fanboys of Thin Man and Fat Boy from the World War sort of named it. Nobody officially calls it that. Just FYI, ISRO does not call it Mangalyaan either. It's called the Mars Orbiter Mission. My guess is somebody in the government started calling it Mangalyaan and then it sort of become the name. So ISRO is very clinical about naming its things. Anyway, so ISRO launched this 3,000 plus kilogram payload into low Earth orbit. So that's your regular orbit in where most of your communication satellites and imaging satellites operate. So it's about a few hundred kilometers above the Earth's surface. And this was heralded as a big deal for India. So this was a new launch vehicle. So finally India has a second reliable launch vehicle that can be bigger. Okay. So in space program, one of the enabling things that we that are necessary are twofold. One is you want to have the lowest possible cost to launch even 1 kilogram of substance into orbit. Okay, that cost has to be as low as possible. The second is that you should be able to launch big payloads. The bigger the payload, the better. Right.
But we've already done the first, and now it sounds like we've done the second.
So it's about, we've just about hit 3,000 kilograms. Forget NASA, but just SpaceX, the private company run by Elon Musk,
yes,
can currently send about 20,000 kilograms to space, to low Earth orbit.
All right.
Okay, so we have a long way to go. So that was the thing. So you had two big events happening, one for ISRO and another for SpaceX. So SpaceX has been solving the cost issue by reusability. So the idea is that you have many stages of a rocket, and these rockets, once they are shot up, they're all destroyed. And so basically you have to build it from scratch again. The American shuttle program was one thing that was the only reusable thing that we have seen in world history, which has been used repeatedly.
Okay.
But that was a insanely bloated, expensive thing for entirely different reasons. True. What SpaceX is already doing is it's recovering parts of its rockets. So the stage one has been reused successfully in June. So which means that the same rocket stage was used for the second time and it was recovered.
Okay.
Maybe it can be even used for a third time. So what's generally happening with SpaceX is that it's rapidly reducing costs.
Okay.
At the same time, it's increasing its payload size.
That's great. And it's what India should be doing?
Yes. And the thing is, Indian space exploration imagination, I argue, is not bold enough. So India is sort of, we are happy every time a PSLV rocket goes, another satellite gets launched. We celebrate. And I have no problem with celebrations, but it's building in a sense of complacency.
So what do you mean by bold? What ideas should we have? Or what lines should we be thinking along?
So one big thing is India, I think, should just put a lot of resources behind getting human spaceflight. India should put humans in space. And the reason this is a big thing is because in order to do this, you need to get so many things right, and you need to innovate on so many counts. You need to not only have a large payload size that you should be able to deliver, the safety rating has to be much superior. Once it's there, a space vehicle, there'll be orbital maneuvers, there'll be other things that happen. You will need to know how to manage them. You will figure out how to manage building human ecosystems in space that can sort of last there for a while. So you will train up astronauts in the process. You will inspire millions and millions of Indians. I mean, imagine if we are sending human beings into space in the next 15 years, maybe. For example, U.R. Rao, the former chairman of ISRO, was also arguing that India should be putting humans into, we should reach Mars in the next 15 years. What that means is that if you're a kid who's studying in school right now, you could be an astronaut in 15 years. Right?
I'm jealous.
Right. And so that's a big motivational thing. I mean, I still remember I was too young. I mean, I was not born when Rakesh Sharma went to space, but Rakesh Sharma was the name when I was growing up in school. Then Kalpana Chawla went to space when I was in school. And so those are big inspirational things. And even if, I mean, not everyone ends up as an astronaut, but you can inspire lots of kids to get into science and engineering and other things and do cool stuff. So the value of a human spaceflight, it captures imagination far more than you just sending a probe into space, right? So it's a big thing that India needs to chew. Not just because it's a big thing that we should do and so on. Also because if ISRO doesn't do this, it will not be competitive in 20 years. We have this myth that we keep talking about how India's space program is very thrifty and, we cost lesser. All these foreign countries and others come and use our launch vehicles because we are cheaper. No, because they use the PSLV and they use ISRO because we are reliable, we are good, we are competent. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's this belief that we are somehow cheaper than anyone else. There is no basis to prove it. Maybe we pay lower salaries and, there are some costs that get hidden. But apart from that, there is no real technological edge that India currently has over other launch vehicle systems. So I'm sure we are competent and we are competitive with all others. What SpaceX is doing is it's completely different now. It's taking things to a next stage. And either we just use SpaceX's services and sort of abandon ISRO or use it only to build satellites and stuff, or, we have to get our act together.
Wow. And what do you think are the first steps that we go about this? Start laying the groundwork for human space missions, or?
Yeah, there's a mission plan that's been in the works for a while. I think maybe it can even be enhanced and it needs to get sort of the prime ministerial approval soon. More than that, I think we need to start thinking differently. I'll tell you why SpaceX and all these other companies, even Jeff Bezos of Amazon has his own space startup and so on. The reason this all started was actually policy and legal history. Initially, when people started going to space, countries sort of thought of space the way you think of Antarctica.
Okay.
It's nobody's property. You can go do research there. You can set up a small base, but you can't own any territory, right? So there were no property rights defined for Antarctica. Space was also initially treated that way. Fundamentally, what has changed is US has said, no, let's stop thinking this way. You still can't own anything in space, but if you can extract resources, whoever extracts them owns them. So it's like fishing, right? Nobody owns the ocean. You go catch fish, the fish are yours. So now if Elon Musk can put things into the moon, you can mine minerals from the moon and you can use it. And what this means is commercial space exploration has been opened up. So you have changed incentives. In India also, we need to start thinking in many, many ways. I mean, why should the space program be equated to ISRO? Can't we have private participation? Can't we have FDI in space? Well, in India, but for space. And so there are lots and lots of these conversations that need to happen. The good news is, at the very base of this, the ISRO's budget has gone up significantly. It's now about 9,000 crores from about 6,000 crores a couple of years ago. It's a welcome first step, but there's a long way to go.
Okay, Pawan, maybe one day we'll have a Hindi equivalent to the pale blue dot speech, which inspires millions of Indians to think beyond
Why
this.
not Kannada or Tamil?
Fair enough. I agree with you. That's it for the first half of the Pragati podcast. In the second half, I'll come back with Pranay Khotastani and Dr. Alka Acharya to talk about all things China.
Hi, I'm Ambika.
And I'm Hoshna.
Come journey with us around India as we chat about new and offbeat destinations, from secret islands to village stays, give you travel tips and advice, discuss all the yummy and weird food we've sampled, and induce some serious wanderlust.
So tune in to the Rediscovery Podcast.
New episodes out every Monday on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app you like.
Hi, welcome back to the Pragati podcast with me, Hamsini Hariharan. Today, I'm joined by my fellow colleague at the Takshashila Institution, Pranay Khotastani. Pranay is also a contributing writer to Pragati. Hi, Pranay.
Ni hao humse nahi.
And today on the show, we have a very special guest. Dr. Alka Acharya from the Institute of Chinese Studies is joining us on today's show. She's visiting Bangalore as a part of Takshashila's Bangalore Fellows program. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Acharya.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be with you.
So everyone's been talking about India and China and the One Belt, One Road project. So can the both of you tell me what's been going on with this?
Yeah. So I think you guys discussed it in your last podcast episode as well. So there was this big meeting in China, and there was sort of a lot of countries which send their representatives for this meeting called the Belt and Road Forum. But India was conspicuous by its absence. There was a lot of news that India hasn't come and it is trying to make a statement. So that's why we are discussing this, and that's why we have no one better. We couldn't have had anyone better than Dr. Alka Acharya, who's one of the foremost experts of China in India. So Dr. Acharya, one thing that's sort of, let's get the Chinese perspective here first, because people always start from what India should do, but let's get the Chinese perspective here. So how important do you think OBOR is from the Chinese point of view, or what importance does it serve for China to become number one in the world?
Well, Pranay, I think those are two different dimensions to the problem at hand. One is that how important is OBOR to China, and how important is it for China to be number one. Although the two will be connected subsequently. But to begin with, I think the Belt and Road Initiative, as it is now termed, earlier on it was One Belt, One Road. And I think there has been some degree of receptivity by the Chinese to the fact that they cannot appropriate the history of Asia and its linkages with Europe across history by terming it as one belt, one road. Indeed, there are many belts and many roads.
If I may interrupt, wasn't One Belt, One Road also as a result of translation problems, or was the Chinese meaning exactly one belt, one road?
Yes, Itailu is one belt, one road, except that the English version now is belt and road, but in Chinese they still continue to call it Itailu, so it's still one belt, one road. But according to them, it's not one as in the English sense of the term, but it's a belt and a road kind of thing. But leave that aside, the fact is that there has been a shift from officially calling it One Belt, One Road to Belt and Road. And unquestionably, this is one of the biggest initiatives that has come out of China, directly associated with President Xi Jinping's vision for the world. And it's clearly invested with a great deal of significance and importance because it would channelize China's increasing economic capacity and the fact that it is one of the biggest economic drivers of the globalized economy into directions where they themselves are going to be benefiting a lot. So it is a combination of political, economic, strategic objectives, and it's all coalescing in this grand vision. And if you look at what it is going to try to do, it's clearly one of the grandest visions.
I was just wondering, when we talk about China's rise, we are now talking about OBOR very much linked to China's rise. So is this a product of China becoming a superpower, or is it the process?
See, it's if we are saying that through OBOR, China is going to become the number one, I think it's not exactly a direct yes or no, but the fact remains that China's rise is now accepted. Okay, that it is gradually inching its way to number one status is also quite evident. They have set themselves their targets. By 2020, they will become the biggest economy in the world. By 2050, they hope to surpass them. Now, One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road is not likely to get accomplished in just 2 years or 4 years down the road. It is again a huge very, very, it involves building these roads and networks across continents and across very difficult geographic terrain. So in one sense, it's going to be taking a lot of time before this connectivity is actually come through. And so my contention would be that we are not saying that OBOR is the vehicle for China becoming number one, but that OBOR is a consequence of China's emergence as a big economic player and eventually a political power to contend with.
So would it be right to say that this is the project that Xi Jinping wants his legacy to be associated with it? This is the grand project for him, right?
Yes. I think through the Belt and Road Initiative, Xi Jinping is hoping to go down in Chinese history alongside the great emperors and the great leaders who transformed China. For Xi Jinping, it's going to be about how China transformed the world. So it's not just about China becoming number one and clearly surpassing all other countries in economic wealth and then eventually power, but how China's visions have helped to transform the world. So it's at that level, it's, a strategy of really grandiose proportions.
Right. So that's the political aspect of it, and that's why a lot of energy is being put into it. On the economic side as well, there is news that there's excess capacity in China and they are looking for better investments overseas. So I think that's how all it is. This project finds importance for other stakeholders as well, say businesses in China or other state firms. Yeah.
True. I think there's no question that the different components that will go into the making of this Belt and Road and eventually making it the kind of connectivity of goods and services and other kind of commercial activities, that China is obviously looking for meeting certain of its very critical economic requirements. Excess capacity is one. The shifting out of industries because of sustainable development concerns that no longer China can support the kind of manufacturing that it does. The very fact that economically they have to now reach different levels. So they have to move from mere manufacturing at the level they are into higher stages. So there are a whole set, and the fact that they have all this excess capacity of cement and steel. So it is killing a lot of birds. And BRI, let us be also clear, it's not just one stone. So a lot of birds with a lot of stones, and they're all going into this grand vision of connectivity.
Yeah, so it's more belt, one stones, right? Okay, so so we understood now. So this is a big, grand economic project, and it has a lot of political implications as well. And this Xi Jinping wants it to be part of his legacy. So now let's come to the Indian aspect, right? So now, what has India done? India says that we have genuine concerns, and one of the big reasons is because the flagship project of OBOR, CPEC, passes through through Pakistan occupied territory. So now let's get to the Indian opposition part of it. What is India implying by not joining this Belt and Road Forum? What was the signal being sent?
See, officially, I think a very clear signal has been sent that because our territorial integrity and sovereignty is being undermined by this act, we will not be part of it. The other, not quite opposition, I would say, but the other concern that has been voiced at official levels, not officially, but at official levels in speeches by the Foreign Secretary, for instance, or some statements from the Foreign Ministry spokesman, that we have our concerns. We have really, this is an initiative that China has undertaken, and if they want other countries, they should approach them. So China should really have discussions with us. We need more information. We have no idea. So there are, what appears from all these statements is that India's concerns are about what are the ulterior motives out here, what are the strategic kind of implications of this connectivity. And so those are part of it.
Right. So fair enough. The basic problem is one of their big project passes through Indian territory. So there is no other option for India but to oppose it. And lots of people have already written about it. But so here we have one of India's big neighbors doing this big grand plan. So our response to that can't be just opposing on a particular stretch of the project, right? Our response has to be much more than that. Do you see any articulation coming about what exactly is our Indian response beyond opposition to CPEC, which we know is justified?
See, I think the fact that we have our problems with the way in which the Chinese have taken one set of standards about area which they claim as their own, particularly Arunachal Pradesh, and preventing developmental projects on that side. And on the other side here, going ahead with developmental projects where we claim territory. So, all those things are definitely recognizable and understood. The question really is that this response is only about the fact that it is passing through territory that we claim. In other words, we have no other objection other than the fact that it compromises our territorial integrity. If that is the case, then we should have something more. If it is, on the other hand, the problem that apart from the fact that it compromises our territorial integrity, that we are actually not very happy about the strategic implications of these roads and so on, then our response should actually be pitched at that level. That maybe this should be part of the strategic dialogue. What is China's strategic intentions? You can't, the difficulty that I see is that if you have strategic concerns, then they have to be conveyed in a way in which you are then reacting to a strategic problem. At the moment, it just appears that you are having a problem only because of the CPEC and the fact that we don't have enough information and so on and so forth. So I feel that India should be asking, or at least putting, a point of view which can. After all, we say that lots of countries are uncomfortable about it. What kind of articulation of that perspective is happening? It's not very much there in the public domain, and so many countries are part of this project. So
as my co-host Pawan Srinath once said, he said, okay, so we have an opposition to China building roads in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir, fine. But what if China wants to invest in roads through Bangalore? We don't really have an opposition to that. So we should maybe figure out how higher opportunity cost is.
No, see, that's why I'm saying that the response really has to be, what specifically are you opposed to, Nobor? If you are saying that we are opposed to OBOR, irrespective of whether the CPEC is there or the fact that they have managed to pull BCIM also within which was BCIM, which predates OBOR, that's also become part of OBOR. So what we are saying is we have problems with Belt and Road. In which case then the question of Chinese investment into India and so on, that should be delinked. So, okay, we have a problem with OBOR, but China, please come in and let's think in terms of how we can invest in building infrastructure within India. The peculiar situation that there is that all around us, we will be having infrastructure building activity, and it's already happening. It's happening in Sri Lanka, it's happening in Nepal, it's happening with Bangladesh, Pakistan. So all around that is happening. And then we say, according to the point you are making, that okay, China come in and build roads inside. But we will not be part of there is a bit of a disconnect between the kind of position that we are saying about China making investments within India, or that we have some partnership with infrastructure investment within India, but no linkage with any of the investment projects if they are part of Belt and Road, just outside Indian territory.
Right. One line of thought that has been doing the rounds is that why invest? So the big concern is that investment. Why should we lose out on investments from China, right? And one of the arguments that is being made is that anyways we have AIIB and the New Development Bank, which is under BRICS. All those are places where India already has a say. So our investments through China won't be affected even if we constantly oppose OBOR, or we take a really hard stance against it. What do you have to say about that?
If I think the Chinese are going to be subsuming more and more and more of this infrastructure development or other connectivity kind of projects within OBOR, then we will have to be very clear as to how we will distinguish between projects that are part of OBOR but on which you are still. So for instance, supposing Nepal were to apply for loan for building something which is billed as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and you are in the bank, what will you do? Similarly, if your other neighbors are wanting to build roads, so clearly you will have to take a position on that. In fact, I think what we need to see is how much of this is actually going to happen irrespective of what our position is going to be. Right. And therefore, how much of it will be literally affecting us without our either taking a position or doing anything, because roads are there. I mean, if it's a road is coming right up to your borders, what are you going to say? I'm not going to take that road. I will build my own road. So, there is a bit of a ludicrousness in this whole thing. Yeah. And India has its own, desire also about connectivity. Look east, and this through the northeast, we are trying to get into a lot of Southeast Asian countries are part of this. Even Japan, with whom we are sharing our apprehensions about this project, even they are looking at what this whole thing is about. So I think what we need to do is, at this point, really focus our energies and examine this proposal with the seriousness that it demands. Right. It cannot be a kind of ad hoc response to certain critical issues, but have this whole open kind of area where it is going to impinge on you regardless.
So, we talked about the Indian apprehensions, etc. But let's see from the Chinese point of view. India is a big market, right? So I'm sure there is a lot of movement within China as well to get India into this big grand plan that China is making. Do you see any news about that? And what are the moves China is making towards that?
At the moment, no news. I mean, the Chinese have just put this out and have sent feelers, very strong feelers to India that they would like India to be part of this. And I think the Chinese themselves are in a bit of a bind, because if India is not part of this OBOR, a great chunk of the kind of returns or the kind of success that they expect from Belt and Road in South Asian, particularly subcontinent, there's going to be a gaping hole. And let's face it, India, with its huge middle class, with its burgeoning young population, with its growth story unfolding, with its capacity, is actually what China needs. Right. So this is for the Chinese also, it's a bit of a frustrating and a baffling situation if India refuses to come on board. And I think India also needs to weigh. I mean, there are a lot of people who are saying we don't need Belt and Road. Fine, I think we can start off with, but then a very serious cost-benefit analysis must be done. This is, I would say that if we can carefully evaluate the kind of advantages that we can get out of it. We are desperately trying to get access to Central Asia. We still have not got through Northeast India through to Southeast Asia. That is still in the making. So many projects are just lying and we are not able to get this whole thing going. So I think both sides have to once again come back and address each other's concerns and see what kind of a wire media can come out of this, because it can be a win-win situation.
That's great. So let's do some crystal gazing here. So how do you see this project? How do you see India's response changing over this project? Do you think there will be a revaluation or an assessment now? Actually, it should have happened much before, but now that this forum has already happened, not attending the forum does not necessarily mean that India cannot be a part of OBOR, right? So how do you see this going ahead? Do you have any sense of how this will flow?
See, for now, it seems that a certain kind of negative response is crystallizing. Right. That there is a great deal of suspicion, there is a great deal of mistrust that is voiced in the kind of reactions we've seen. So it's more about the strategic implications of these communication networks and the kind of channels that are sought to be established. Now, what we need to figure out is whether not being part of the Belt and Road would eventually help us address those long-term strategic consequences. Does it actually make for us being better prepared by not joining, or does it make does it actually help us in dealing with a situation that is likely to unfold over the next 5 to 7 years as far as the Chinese presence in and around and all these networks are concerned? So essentially what I'm saying is that by not being part of it, you can, of course, make your opposition, you can voice your concerns, you can raise legitimate worries, and you can, of course, that whole CPEC issue. But this is not a project which is going to stop because of all these legitimate concerns, yes. Strategic worries, yes. But it's going to happen. So do you want to at least be part of the discourse and keep those concerns alive, or watch the way in which this whole agenda that the Chinese are now unfolding is going to take shape? So you are really out of the shaping of this very important strategic...
Right. Yeah, exactly. And because India is such a big economy, and by its own right, it can be a pole which can either determine how other countries react to Belt and Road Initiative as well. And that's why I think India's response is important. And its response can't be just based on one particular territorial integrity problem, which is all genuine, but the response has to include much more.
Yeah, the point is that all your neighbors are actually excited by the opportunity it offers. So if you are saying that many countries have concerns, then I think there should be an attempt to find out what the nature of that concern is. Is it the same as yours? Because ultimately, the position that you will take on Belt and Road, or that you will try and shape some kind of a common position, the interests have to gel. And my worries about this road and, say, country X's worries about the road have to ultimately come together for us to take a common position. So, as I said, that we share a lot of these anxieties along with Japan, but Japan sent a representative to find out what's happening. The Americans sent, Europeans sent. Of course, there are going to be questions. We already see that the Europeans were raising some questions, that they were not part of the signing and all. But I don't think the Chinese have not anticipated this. And this was one attempt to see what are the kind of concerns that other countries have. And they will try to weave it into it, because this is too important for them to, just bulldoze it. They will. It's going to fail if they don't have on board the majority of the countries. And what they're doing is working their way to getting the support of the maximum number of countries. So India really has to now see where it stands as far as this juggernaut is going.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to end this podcast. But what fascinates me is that just a year back we were discussing about TPP and the American presence in Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, and now it's all out. The terms are being set by China, and we are discussing Belt and Road initiatives twice in Pragati podcast as well. So that just shows the importance as well. Thanks a lot, Dr. Acharya.
Thank you, Dr. Acharya. All right, that's our show for today. You can find new episodes of the Pragati podcast every fortnight on the IVM podcast app or any other podcasting app you prefer. And of course, on thinkpragati.com.
Excuse me, bhaiya. एक्सक्यूज मी,
बोलिए मैडम।
मेन्यू में क्या है?
मेन्यू में सीन अनसीन है, पॉडकास्ट है, ऑनकोर्स है, साइरस है, मेड इन इंडिया, रीडिस्कवरी प्रोजेक्ट, एम्पावरिंग सीरीज, सेक्स वैक्स है, IVM लाइक्स है, सिंप्लीफाइड है, कीपिंग इट क्वियर है, टिंग्स एंड डेस्टिनेशंस है, माय नेबर जकरबर्ग है और द फैन गराज है। आपको क्या चाहिए?
एक बार रिपीट कर देंगे क्या?
रिपीट नहीं करता हम, आप जाओ IVMpodcast.com पे और सुनो ये सब, या फिर डाउनलोड करो उनका ऐप, सब आपकी उंगलियों पे।